We have ahead of us a very interesting panel on justice. And here I'm going to frame justice in the context of climate change, because that's been a topic that we've been talking about for the last couple of days. And justice here would refer to specifically environmental and social justice. And I have a very distinguished panel of speakers here. I'd like to start by just asking them to give a 30-second or quick introduction of themselves before we start the panel. So I'll start with Cynthia, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, my name is Cynthia. I work here with the Singapore Management University in its Asian Business and Rule of Law initiative, collaborating on issues relating to business and human rights throughout the region, and also with UNGPs. And prior to that, I was a litigator, NGO litigator, on behalf of Indigenous peoples and minorities before the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, and also the European Court of Human Rights.
Hi, my name is Max Everest-Phillips. I'm director here of the United Nations Development Programme's Global Centre on Public Service Excellence. We are jointly funded by the Government of Singapore and by UNDP to promote public service reform around the world. Before undertaking this job 2 years ago, I was Director of Governance at the Commonwealth Secretariat in London.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Graveyard Shift. My name's Simon Lord. I'm called a Group Sustainability Officer. I think sometimes it should be Group Responsible Sustainability Officer, but never mind. Just moved to Sime, Darby in KL in April of this year. Before then, I was 20 years in Papua New Guinea, working with New Britain palm oil. And all in all, I've spent 30 years in this industry. That's it.
Good afternoon, everybody. Assaad Razzouk. I chair a Hong Kong-based association called the Association for Social and Responsible Investing in Asia. And I also run a clean energy independent power producer called Syndicatum Sustainable Resources, which is headquartered in Singapore and builds and operates clean energy power plants in India, Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines, and China. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Perhaps I should also quickly introduce myself. Before I joined the Singapore Institute of International Affairs, I was actually working with the ASEAN Secretariat in Jakarta. I was based in Indonesia for 4 years, working with ASEAN's dialogue partners, particularly the US, Japan, EU, Germany, in supporting some of ASEAN's economic as well as political social programs. So very excited to be here today. So the panel today that we're looking at is justice, and we'll be focusing at looking at how non-state actors can basically play a role in promoting access to justice, particularly for marginalized groups that are most affected by climate change. And by this, I'm talking about women, indigenous people, as well as perhaps even migrant workers. So perhaps I'll start by just asking each panelist to share your views, your thoughts on this issue before we open up to Q&A. Cynthia, please. Cynthia has asked for slightly more time to explain her position, so I'm giving her around 5 to 6 minutes, but for the rest of this panelists, you still have 3 minutes.
And then I promise to behave afterwards.
Okay.
I just want to frame things as comprehensively as I can. And I think what I would really like to showcase here is just, in terms for me, one of the glaring gaps is really, that's really at the source of so many human rights violations across the region, and even the source of probably a lot of the haze that we've breathed over the last couple of months, is really the land tenure insecurity that's prevalent across the region, and as a result of weak land governance systems. And so it really affects a broad section of industries. It's definitely not just related to agriculture or palm oil, but also, for example, it relates to mining and even the production of large infrastructure projects. And so, even the Kadin, for example, the Chamber of Commerce in Indonesia had lamented the impact that this has on business as they try to operate above board for various reasons, including the uncertainty over the legality of numerous land concessions, also the inconsistent implementation of certain regulations and policies, not to mention the lack of clarity over the role between the central and local governments within that country. And so the ensuing confusion leads invariably to, well, not invariably, but too often to conflict, which stems from the competing interests over limited resources. And so, for example, in Indonesia alone, there's over 8,000 conflicts relating to land, 4,000 of which are probably associated with palm oil. In Cambodia, there's also been lots of land claims in relation to, for example, sugarcane plantations, the arbitrary displacement of communities for that purpose, which has led to conflict and also very expensive lawsuits for those involved. And so if we consider this state of affairs in the context of the SDGs, the fallout's particularly alarming, especially when you consider the extent to which land tenure security has such a powerful impact on things like food security of communities, the resilience of these communities, women's empowerment, and just more generally, the effort to reduce extreme poverty. So what I'd like to showcase in terms of what companies can do to this effect to lessen the impact, it's in terms of meaningful and inclusive engagement with communities when they are engaging in large-scale land acquisitions. Because again, across various sectors, this is necessary as part of the business operations. And so when they're doing this, whether you look to the UNDPs or the IFC performance standards or other standards, including the SDG 16, which relates to inclusive and participatory decision-making, enhanced due diligence involves, among other things, extensive ground truthing, which means really going on the ground level and speaking to community leaders, religious leaders, but also people who are not necessarily leaders within the communities, but that are other segments, for example, women, disabled people, whatever. And the more informal these things take place, and also the earlier they take place, the better. And then a precursor to when we're engaging, or when companies are engaging in the process of large-scale land acquisitions, an important factor to take into account is that they should never assume that the legal title or lack thereof is the full story in terms of the land's occupation and use. And so again, enhanced due diligence really requires digging deeper to understand the ownership, occupation, and land use patterns, and really not relying on the word of the government as being the last word. Again, once you've gained a fuller picture, it's really important to recognize customary land rights on a similar or parallel level to that of the ones with formal ownership, especially when we're dealing with issues around negotiation, compensation, and ongoing permission for land use. And when we're dealing with indigenous peoples in particular, then I think most people are aware of the FPIC principles. But other at-risk groups also that need to be considered are the landless. And again, if we look at the SDGs and its effort to really bring everyone into the picture, often landless people are dispossessed as a result of large-scale land acquisitions, and that affects their ability to survive in terms of, given the fact that they're often serving as laborers on other people's lands to do their farming. So again, when we're looking at strategies on how to mitigate that, that should be taken into consideration. And obviously then if we go to women, the fact that women, so few of them actually have their name on land titles, that shouldn't be used as an excuse not to engage with them. And really trying to understand how they use the land, how they benefit from the land, how benefits from the land are in fact divided between men and women, and how ensuing changes could impact them disproportionately, and again, for strategies to take that into account. Another thing that due diligence would look like in this context is for companies to minimize their land use wherever possible. And this begins with assessing your own needs fairly in accordance to genuine requirements. And an example is just that if you go ahead and have large idle land banks over several years, that can just create a lot of tension and resentment when you're bordered around by landless people. Also returning the land when it's no longer used for operations, if that's possible. Again, in the mining sector, that's generally less possible. But also leasing land instead of actually purchasing it when that's possible so that it can provide a steady source of income to landholders is another option. And then on this note, more creative and inclusive benefit sharing may also include supplementing land use arrangements with community investment activities to ensure that they can access essential services or income and wealth creation activities, and also to be able to access technology that is often not available to them. And then just a second little parallel to that in terms of a further role that companies can play is really looking at initiatives that to make value chains more inclusive. And key considerations to this end is, for example, identifying customary land through participatory mapping with GPS equipment, for example, again with the active participation of community representatives, and also supervised by company officials where necessary. But also in terms of natural resource management, there's value in companies identifying priorities for the development needs of communities, proposing management solutions for resources that are critical for the sustainable livelihoods of these communities and their food security, enhancing the knowledge of agricultural practices for the purpose of heightened productivity, which has been discussed through this week, and also proposing alternative land use practices and income sources to reduce pressures on biodiversity. So for example, in Kenya, some of the work I did turned on the nexus between conservation, pastoralism, and tourism, which I'm happy to discuss further later on. And through these sort of initiatives, I guess the fallout or the outcome is that there's harmful impacts on the livelihoods of communities are reduced. Smallholders are in a better position to increase their productivity and access equitable opportunities. And companies also stand to benefit from healthier and more secure supply chains. So I'll stop with that framing statement and continue.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. Max, please.
I'd like to pick up on that because I thought that was a splendid coverage of two key aspects of governance around power and incentives. And how do we align those in the right way? And I think some of the ideas that you've just heard were excellent. And that getting that right is critical. My interest is in how public service, public officials respond, how we make sure that people who join the public service may join for many different reasons, but many people, even in contexts where they are not necessarily well paid and where public service can sometimes be a sort of job creation scheme, still public service and many people who work in it are trying to work for the public good or a general public welfare. And I think we need to focus on that, how we inspire and make sure that officials have the capability to undertake their tasks, have the support. But within public service, there are always, in my experience, some champions of genuine reform. Indeed, if there weren't, reform wouldn't happen. So what I'm interested in doing and looking at how we can create adaptive public service that responds to these sorts of needs, how we uphold the impartiality of public service, fairness, in other words, because I think that is a critical factor if we're going to ensure that poor, vulnerable communities are treated fairly. And the third aspect, which I think is also critical of public service, is obviously capability, some sort of more ensuring a meritocratic public service in that promotion incentives are geared around encouraging the best people. If we can get that right, it complements the reform ideas that you've just heard. So I will stop there.
Thank you, Max. Simon, please.
I'm more than happy to have an on-stage chat about what I think is land rights and justice, because I'm not here to defend the palm oil industry, because I don't think there's anything wrong with palm oil. I think there's a hell of a lot wrong with the way that some people grow it and some people choose to plant it. Experiences in Papua New Guinea, which is both patriarchal and matriarchal society, 97% of the land is customary owned. And the government recognises customary land rights. The trouble is, there's no framework to actually legalise those. Companies like my own, therefore, have to operate in a void. The work that everybody now says is FPIC, and I'm not so sure it's principles, it's more of a process, because it's dynamic and it's ongoing. It's not a one-off, it's not a box-ticking exercise. But the principles of FPIC, long before FPIC became called what it was simply the way that we had to go about mobilising land. The company in New Britain actually doesn't own any land in Papua New Guinea. We have a very small centre of alienated land. The rest of it is rented from that community. It's rented for a period of what we call 2 cycles. And in return for a ground rent, which also, by the way, includes the areas which we will not plant on because they are either have a conservation value, and that can be 1 to 6, the last 3 being about social values, or indeed high carbon, because they're forests, or indeed because they serve some kind of ecosystem service, we still pay that community a ground rent for that land, because it's the only way that collectively we can begin to actually preserve those. But at the same time, that raises challenges, because often the community want us to plant that land, and so a lot of dialogue and exchange has to go about. So they have a ground rent and royalties from the crop, so there is an ongoing and secure part of the participatory mapping, which is absolutely vital, and it's no good just doing it by satellite. You have to walk the ground with the community, and that means you have to know who the community is. So genealogy, and establishing the genealogy links in PNG, tribes, sub-tribes, clans, sub-clans, you have established who owns what. And it's not just mapping with the community that you're going to be working with. You have to map with the communities surrounding, even though they may not agree to working with you. Because participatory mapping is 2 sides of a boundary. So ground rent, you're getting royalties, and also we used to issue shares in the company. That meant that they had a valid reason for maintaining a constant dialogue with us. And part of that dialogue is to have a very, very solid grievance procedure. I think some of you would agree. Because without the mechanism to feed back where you've got a problem with that company or with officers of that company, because we're not all perfect, and quite frankly, we make a lot of mistakes. But where you can have a grievance mechanism, you can swiftly resolve things to both the communities and the company's satisfaction. I'm from Yorkshire, as you can probably tell from my accent, and we have a saying, you know, good fences make good neighbours. Good negotiations make good neighbours. It's in nobody's interest to have conflict palm oil. It really doesn't do the industry any good, and it doesn't do the business any good, and it doesn't do the communities. Because when you talk to them, they actually don't want conflict. They want to actually develop. The milk is spilt, populations are expanding. We need to intensify what agricultural land that we've got. And you're only going to bring about those crop improvements, whether it's oil palm or what we encourage is alternative livelihoods as well. You need to increase that, because food security is linked to food sovereignty of a particular community. And I'll stop there.
Yep, thank you very much. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions for you later, Simon, but I'd like to move on to Assaad now, please.
Thank you. If I may, I just want to take this conversation a few steps back, because I'm not a palm oil or land use expert. So just a question maybe to all of you in the audience. How many of you have actually read the SDGs, all 169 of them? Can you please raise your hand? Just entertain me for a second. How many of you actually read all 169 SDGs?
There's not going to be an exam, is there?
There might be, I mean, given this, yeah, okay. So can we say 10? 10 people. Kind of a related question, just to bring this back to justice and climate change. As you heard most of the day yesterday, there's a very big climate gathering taking place in Paris in a couple of weeks. 45,000 people are going to be attending, slightly less than 200 countries, as well as several hundred NGOs, think tanks, etc. In essence, what they're doing in Paris is they've asked all signatories to the UNFCCC Convention to write a mini business plan for the low-carbon development path of their country. In typical UN fashion, they picked a confusing acronym for that business plan, which is called an intentionally nationally determined contribution, whatever, INDC. So that's really a low-carbon business plan for the economy between now and 2020. So here's my second question to the audience. How many of you have read more than 2 INDCs? There's 150 low-carbon business plans that have been filed by sovereign states, which actually make for some, fascinating reading. But how many of you have read at least 2? Okay, I can see the same faces that read the SDGs. And I think that if you just read a sample, one of the most fascinating things is that none of these low-carbon business plans that I've read actually references the SDGs in any way, and certainly not justice or climate justice, whichever one you pick. So then, okay, take a step back. So between my various roles, I talk regularly to maybe 100 financial institutions and corporates or more. Now, how do you think we're supposed to deal with, on the one hand, countries issuing low-carbon business plans, and on the other hand, kind of another pocket issuing 169 Sustainable Development targets, with 17 goals, which nobody has read. So how are we supposed to, what are we supposed to do if the governments themselves haven't bothered to integrate the SDGs into their low-carbon business plans, which doesn't make any sense whatsoever as far as I'm concerned, but maybe there's some logic somewhere. And my point is that this is a certain recipe for justice washing. So we had greenwashing before. I think expect justice washing from a big segment of the private sector, because they're going to kind of make the right noises, then hide behind semantics, and the net result is that because there's no integration, people like us who are running around asking companies to sign up to principles that are related to the SDGs and responsible investing and environmental and social investing are always going to have a hard time reconciling rhetoric with facts on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can I just comment on that? Because I think it's slightly unfair. The SDGs, to be comprehensive, include climate change. But I think the UN did recognize that the climate change area in itself was the main or the key thrust on it. So the SDGs incorporate climate change from the point of view of ensuring sort of universality. But it's in no way meant to detract from the climate change area as sort of the key thrust in international efforts.
I fully understand, Max. My point is that the INDCs, which are low-carbon business plans, are economy-wide. And really, they are comprehensive, some of them. Some of them are very bad, but some are actually not bad. Those that are not bad, you would think, would tackle poverty, justice, hunger, but they don't. And so, that's kind of the, there's nobody bringing it together other than perhaps the International Institute in Singapore. I don't know. It's somebody kind of just putting the whole thing together so that we know what to do.
Right, okay. So just taking up on your point, as well as what Cynthia mentioned about due diligence, which you sort of emphasize. I'll throw the question now to Simon. You've spoken a lot about what your company does in Papua New Guinea. Just in terms of due diligence, what has Sime Darby done in this area, in the sense of renting the land from the people, ensuring there's participation in terms of, talking about how the plantations we manage, what are the benefits that will go back to the communities. Could you give us examples of due diligence that Sime does?
Yeah, you want concrete examples?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. I think the first thing is know who you're talking to, know where they are.
And the challenges as well.
Sorry?
And the challenges that comes with doing due diligence on the
I'll
ground.
cover them afterwards.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's so many. I mean, I've got time. If you don't mind staying here for about 3 hours, I'll finish the whole lot of the challenges that we face. I think the first thing is to know what you're talking about and where you're talking about it. When we start talking about communities, I wonder how many palm oil plantations, pulp and paper plantations, coconut plantations actually know what that community consists of, what the demography of that community is, how it's made up, how it's governed, how it's worked. In terms of due diligence, the first thing for us, and I think in many sustainability where it concerns land, is about maps. It's knowing where people are and having clear, accurate maps, because then you can work in defined areas. Going back into those communities, part of the due diligence is that we allow the community to set up what they call in Papua New Guinea an incorporated land group. It's a democratic elected process in which a community manages. Now, the first time, and we've been there 45 years, the first ones that we set up, we thought the best thing to do was to stand back. Just let the process take a natural course. And we were lambasted by many of the NGOs, and quite rightly, because what happened is that many elites within that community took over the process, and in taking over that process, because Papua New Guinea in many areas is very strongly dominated by males, it disenfranchised all of the females. And in females in Papua New Guinea, 70% of them are involved in agriculture, but only 16% of them are actually in the decision-making process. So part of it was then deciding that we needed to help and guide, but we needed to be independent. So we brought in people to advise them. Sometimes it was legal. Sometimes it was people who were anthropologists who advised them on how best to construct these committees, which would manage what were considerable amounts of money. We realized that there was a capacity building problem in that while literacy rates are very, very low in Papua New Guinea, fiscal literacy, which people tend to forget about, is even lower. Then we realized that many of the groups were electing office bearers who were male. So we worked with the women's groups to have them as an equal voice, 50-50, within the actual process. And in our smallholders, we also carried that over using very practical recognition cards, not identity cards. This was crop cards. That there would be what we call a papa card and a mama card. And that these had separate bank accounts and that the money was going into separate streams into an account in which only the person with the card could withdraw the money from it. So it's some kind of security on that one. Those are just two examples, a bit more. Challenges, bloody difficult, really difficult. We work with 15,000 smallholders. We know where every single one of them is. We know what their family makeup is. Some disasters, World Bank, when it set up the project in the 1960s, never considered the generational change aspects. A community has a small holding, and it's great for one family. But they have children because they're prosperous. And now you've got 2 generations living on the same piece of land because it was a land settlement scheme. You know, really, God forbid, we never do land settlement schemes ever again. So we changed the whole of that process, recognizing because of external advice about these generational issues, so that now we only ever work with what we call village oil palm. If this room was the village, we would talk with the village about how much land they needed for traditional user rights. Hunting and gathering is still traditional in Papua New Guinea. How much land would be needed to grow the food crops and anticipate the growth rates of the village, and how much that we thought that village would want to commit to planting palm oil. The whole process, its shortest it's ever taken me is 2 years, and we're only talking about 1,000 hectares. The longest it's taken me is 8 years, and that's not because I was browbeating communities. It was because people needed time to digest and to think. We're now at a phase where we're bringing in the concept of high carbon stock. What is a forest and what is deforestation? It's going to take a similar amount of time to work with communities for them to totally understand that why we would need to preserve these forests if the world's actually going to survive. And so I had a question with you, which was interesting, is that when is the world going to recognize that there's a value to a forest which is other than what happens to the wood when you've chopped it and removed it, or what happens when you've replaced it with another crop? Because until we get some kind of red mechanism going, which actually can put money back into communities, forests will not stay. They will continue to be deforested. And I don't think it's deforestation. I think it's degradation.
So just taking the discussion a step back, Cynthia, you've worked in Africa as well, advocating on behalf of minorities as well as indigenous people. And you're supporting the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights in terms of implementation of the UN guiding principles at the national level. So based on your experience, what are some of the challenges that you see, in how companies, businesses, non-state actors can do to sort of promote and protect justice and human rights for some of these people that we're talking about here?
One of the things I would say is just really, transforming the way that the private sector and the government engages with small-scale farmers, with indigenous communities, with minorities. I think there's already kind of a broad understanding out there that we can't have it as business as usual as it's been historically, but what that really means in practice is what's difficult. And as Sime was saying, you're having a conversation with 1,000 people. That's 1,000 different opinions potentially, or even if you want to perhaps have a women's group, again, even just there, sometimes there's a delicate balance to be made, because if you're going into a community where women have historically not have much of a say, you know what I mean? So for me as well, one of the communities I was working with, it was over maybe a period of 7 years, it was maybe into the 4th or 5th year that we had real meetings with the women, because had I gone in there, arriving from the UK, saying, what we need to do is talk about the women and with the women, the trust element that was mentioned previously in the morning, they would have said, this woman so out of touch, she has no idea, she's a gringa from, and anyway. And so we developed this trust, and then we were able to bring it more practically, especially in terms of when we could link on how their needs fit in with those of the men, and so that it was creating a symbiotic thing. Yesterday somebody had a great quote about when the mother understood, the father stopped burning, something to that effect, of just seeing where the linkages are. And really so much in terms of community engagement, whether it's the government or whether it's private sector or others, or even NGOs. Like I said, sometimes NGOs are themselves out of touch. It's really about trying to work with communities as active stakeholders rather than passive beneficiaries. So maybe what we were doing 10 years ago, whether it was NGO or private sector or government, was handouts and saying, now we've paid them and they're going to be happy. That's not sustainable. So again, it's about creating revenue streams, and more importantly, giving them an element of choice. Maybe they don't even want to be smallholders anymore. Maybe they want to do something differently that opens other avenues. And somebody again yesterday said a term that I really liked, and it was, or maybe this morning, of seeing them as co-creators of products and services. Again, just semantics there become important. They're not beneficiaries, they're co-creators, they're your partners potentially. And yeah, really looking at reframing the end game in terms of mutually beneficial outcomes instead of really approved, which is consistent with the principles of the SDGs, rather than the zero-sum game that, was probably the modus operandi for far too long. Yeah, I think I'll stop there
Right.
just for a moment.
I mean, that's a very interesting point. I was talking to a few people yesterday as well, and they mentioned that for some of these big agribusiness companies, they would never choose to work with international NGOs. Rather, they work with local NGOs they understand, you know, what the culture, the traditions, and what the local practices, customary rights are. It just makes it more effective and efficient as well.
Well, it comes down to a level of respect and
Yes.
understanding. So if international NGOs want to commit the time to gain that understanding, that's fine. But often, even donor-driven pressures will do that you have to resolve this project or this case in 2 years. How can you dive into a community and in 2 years, you know, the courts won't even move that fast anyway. But I think sometimes you just have to have the discipline to push those factors aside and convince the donors or whoever's funding you that, you know, that is not the viable way forward. Again, that touches on what a colleague had said this morning, or perhaps a kindred spirit rather, when she was saying, you know, in terms of donors, they're not always looking at results. They're looking at outputs and inputs, shifting away from that, and really looking at what works on the ground to bring about effective change and sustainable change.
Max, any response since you are representing the government, the donors? Not outcomes oriented, which is not very UN, I think.
Well, I think there's a degree of truth in that, certainly. But I also think it's important, as I mentioned earlier, to look at how public officials respond to these challenges and what we can do about strengthening their interest and capability, because it's sort of taken for granted or pushed to one side rather than being seen as critical. And to my mind, besides the excellent work that NGOs clearly do and private sector interests that are working in the right way, capacity building of public service officials to engage properly on this and to have their incentives and interests fully understood. How do we motivate and encourage the right sort of way for public officials at all levels to respond and not to be sort of seen either as part of the problem or irrelevant? And I think looking at questions of motivation, for example, leadership, these things also are important.
Please.
Just made me think there. I think we often talk about failed governments. I mean, I work in Papua New Guinea, I work in Liberia, and some of the most remote and poorest countries, I think, in the world, and certainly in the UN Development Index. And we often think about the government failing us, but actually, I think what we have done as private industry, and NGOs as well, we failed the governments by not really bringing the sustainability agenda. It's very much into the fore in a partnership way. We engage with the governments and it'll be about price, it'll be about barriers, it'll be about tariffs, it'll be about export, it'll be about commerce. And yet we cannot continue business as usual. We are all talking about sustainability, most responsible companies, and I never say we're a sustainable company. I say, because I don't think I can point to one thing that I've done that is sustainable. I think future generations will decide that. But I can look at something that I've done and I think, well, that was a responsible action that we took. And I don't think we've engaged the governments enough on the sustainability agenda. And what I think about the Sustainable Development Goals is that gives us a second or a third opportunity. Because in the agricultural industry, and I can't speak for others, and I can't really speak for anything other than tropical, I think we just let the Millennium Development Goals just wash over us. We really didn't take cognizance of those. Now there's a real chance with these Sustainable Development Goals and with the GRI compass guiding companies through this process, and a lot more willingness from companies to actually take this debate to governments. And it would be lovely to see a partnership, a tripartite of NGOs and private industry bringing this to the attention of governments jointly.
On that very progressive note, I'm going to open up to the floor for questions. I'm not getting Wi-Fi access here, so if you have any burning questions, please stand up, raise your hands, and ask and pose your questions to the panel, please. Is there anyone? I see one hand, 2, 3. I'm just gonna let I'll let all 3 of you ask questions, and then the panel can address them at the same time. Please go ahead. The lady on my left.
Hi, I'm Renee. On the issue of justice, at the epicenter of the man-made crisis in Palangkaraya, where there are documented deaths of about 19 haze-related deaths, and God knows how many undocumented deaths. We're talking about small families, breadwinners of the families, who have no access to justice and no access to legal representation. And they're certainly not bringing up a class action suit against the government. So perhaps people like Simon and Cynthia could suggest what they can do to stand up for the human rights and get legal representation. We have the Transboundary Pollution Act that's been enforced for years, and we are now talking about a crisis of epic proportions. No one has been prosecuted, no one has been put into jail, and yet, we have laws that's supposed to have extraterrestrial outreach.
Thank you. And there was someone in the middle. Yes. Could you bring the mic to her, please?
Hi, my name is Marion. A question, obviously, regarding the palm oil industry. We've been in there for 3 months, but the thing it's not only about the last 3 months. It's about since 1997. So it's not as if the issue is new, and it seems that it's getting worse and worse. Listening to your experience from Sime Darby, we have here, it seems like the state of the art of palm oil in a way, but what about what is happening in Indonesia? What shall we do? Some people, some NGOs are talking about responsible palm oil, but now there is an emergency, and you've mentioned it, you say it's not deforestation, it's extermination. So at a point, shall we say, where is the solution? Is the solution in the legal framework? Say, okay, for the time being, no more concession for palm oil industry. Where is the solution coming from your also from your business point of view?
Thank you. I'll take the last question and then I'll turn it back to the panel.
Hi, my name is Ong. I just want to ask a simple question. How many of the panelists, I'm sure you would answer it, and how many of the audiences has actually been to the plantations? I know that some of you are obviously not from this region, all right? So how many have actually been on the ground? Or will we prefer that we actually see it on YouTube or on TV? That's all.
Thank you. Now I'll turn the questions back to the panel, and Assaad and Max, feel free to chip in as well.
I can try.
Do you want me to start with the Transboundary Haze Pollution Act?
Sure.
I think with the act of, maybe the first thing I would just mention is that it hasn't actually been in force for many years. It's actually quite recent since it's been in force, maybe within the last year, a few months. So at that time, in that respect, I think it's too early to say what really will be its real scope. I think one thing that is exciting, at least for a lawyer, is its potential in terms of civil and criminal liabilities. And of course, because it's transboundary, it can go and address some of the issues taking place in Indonesia without necessarily suing the Indonesian government. It's at the company level, and I think that if you look at the geopolitics at play, that's quite important, because I don't think that Singapore is really in a position to sue Indonesia. It's, being the economic giant that it is in the region. Somebody yesterday mentioned whether it was a crime against humanity or not, and I don't have the time to go into all the legal details why on a legal basis it's not, per se, although morally I would say that it certainly weighs in that direction. I just think it makes for a very good soundbite to at least tune our minds to the degree of the crisis and its intensity. One thing that local communities can do is access non-judicial grievance based mechanisms, you know, of the companies that are involved in some of this activity, even if they're maybe not directly responsible, you know, because again, the land concessions are not clear, it's difficult to see who started, who's finished the fires, but I think at this point, most companies involved would be open to starting discussion with communities on ways of mitigating some harms if possible. But more importantly, I think there's a lot of scope because there's a growing network of pro bono lawyers across the region, both within fancy law firms, but also at the NGO level that are willing to start helping communities on this precise issue. And also a plug for a class action that is actually in the pipeline. Yeah. Is a local Singaporean NGO that is taking this forward called Haze Elimination Action Team. It's called HEAT. And I think they're going to be doing a lot of great work, so watch that space, and it's probably important to get in touch with them. So I think some of the key issues, though, is that still the answers will not lie in, even if we got big prosecutions out of the act, I think that really the end result is about solving it, you know, reform within Indonesia and working constructively with Indonesia and the smallholders and all other actors involved to look at the root issues of the problem.
Simon, please.
Yeah. Short term, bring those prosecutions. Do everything you possibly can. But bear in mind the complexity, which you rightly point out in Indonesia. Longer term, help Indonesia sort out its one map policy. You see, there are two different government organisations that give concessions. One is a forestry, and it gives a concession. But when you come to convert that area into any agriculture, it's a different department. That then produces your Hagyu. And that's a smaller area. Very often, when you look at the land, a responsible company will not develop all of that land for the simple reason there'll be high conservation value, riparians, etc., etc. So the actual plantation can be very small. But logged is the concession to the original person that applied for it. Meanwhile, even areas that companies set aside, and you've got an exhibit here from April, you should see what's happening in the degradation of that area through burning that they have to deal with. They spend about $2.5 million so far in just putting out fires outside of that concession just to preserve it. I'm not saying they're the best company in the world. I'm not saying they're the worst company in the world. It's just a reality. But those concessions are overlapped. And very often, the ownership is not known. One of the problems is Indonesia has declared it to be illegal for any company to release those maps. I will be prosecuted if I release those maps. In Malaysia, we have a similar situation with the Official Secrets Act. I don't have a restriction in Papua New Guinea. I don't have a restriction in Liberia. You can go onto the World Resource Global Forest Watch, you want real time, go onto that website, and you can see where those hotspots are using the NASA satellites and where the most deforestation has occurred. And you will see where there are concession maps. Longer term solution, very quick, I'm sorry. I could go on for hours. I mean, you know, all right. The age of concession is over. It should never happen. You're right for the gentleman that said, how many of you have gone to see a plantation? It's a continuous landscape that has been made to fit to oil palm. That is not the way we should be growing it. Oil palm should fit into the landscape, and you cannot fit into just an environmental landscape. It has to be a social landscape as well.
Assaad, please. Quick one, though.
Well, I was just going to make a general point. I mean, I think we can't help the Indonesian government. They're going to have to help themselves. Generally speaking, you know, you have to follow the money. The companies and plantation owners, you know, have one boss, which is the money. So that's going to be a bank or an insurance company or the financial markets or the stock markets. And that's where action has to be taken, because if their money became more expensive, then they behave more responsibly. And in effect, their money is very cheap. And so they get away with what they're getting away with. But I wouldn't sit and wait for a government to act, or frankly, legal action is going to take, decades. So we have to do something at the level of civil society, and it's going to be faster and louder.
Thank you. I think our time is up, so please join me in thanking the panelists for their insights.